So with that, I don't want to talk anymore. I'd like to get our program going. And so it gives me great pleasure to now introduce Peter Bergen to the stage. So, Peter, welcome. If you will allow me, I will read briefly Peter's bio, which honestly doesn't do justice. But Peter is a print, podcast, and television journalist, producer, think tank executive at New America Foundation, professor at Arizona State University, and the author or editor of 10 books, 3 of which were named New York Times bestsellers. And I love getting coffee with Peter because I invariably get copies of the books without having to buy them, and they have a nice inscription. So I would encourage you, in return for that investment in me, to go out and buy his books, please. But they've been translated into 24 languages, 4 documentaries, 2 of which were nominated for Emmys, and 1 won an Emmy. And he's testified before U.S. congressional committees 18 times about national security issues, and has held teaching positions for graduate students at Harvard and Johns Hopkins University. And Peter's produced films for CNN, HBO, Discovery, among others, and has written for every major newspaper and magazine in the United States. And it gives me great pleasure to ask Peter to give you the presentation he has today. Thank you. Thanks, Peter.
Thank you, Peter Rabley, and thank you to OGC for this kind invitation. I apologize for not being Vint Cerf. I was really looking forward to hearing what he would have to say. So I'm a very, I would say, indifferent substitute for Vint Cerf, but I will do my best. So the subject of my talk is, we have January 20th, we'll have a new administration, and kind of looking at some of the challenges and opportunities for that administration coming in, and the commonalities between Biden and Trump that people often, I think, overlook, because it's useful for both sides to pretend that the other side is completely different from their side, whereas in fact there are quite a lot of commonalities, which I'll get to in a minute. So we're at we're always at a major point in world history where things could go wrong, and that's one of the points where we're at right now, with the largest land war in Europe since World War II, probably the most unstable moment in the Middle East in decades. President Xi has told the People's Liberation Army to be ready to seize Taiwan by 2027, which is obviously during President Trump's second term. And President Putin has fixed the constitution so he can remain in office until 2036. And I'm sure if he lives to 2036, he'll fix it again, so he can live even, run even longer. So, what are the differences and similarities between the Biden administration and the Trump administration? I'm going to start. I think we know what the differences are, so I'm going to start with the similarities. So the similarities on, I would say, 3 very big issues. The first one is China. Now, the Trump administration abandoned what had really been a fantasy that many American administrations had, which is as China progressed economically, it would also liberalize its political system. Well, in fact, the inverse happened. As it became a bigger economic superpower, it actually became a much more repressive power, and of course imprisoned 2 million Uyghurs and other ethnic groups in effectively concentration camps and created the world's most efficient surveillance state. So in 2017, the Trump team, led by H.R. McMaster at the time, issued a new national security strategy, essentially saying China is stealing hundreds of billions of dollars of our intellectual property, is planning to compete with us as a peer, is making all the right moves militarily to do that. And as a result of which, the Trump administration, slapped tariffs on thousands of Chinese goods, increased freedom of navigation exercises in the South China Sea, which of course the Chinese see as a Chinese lake and are trying to turn into a Chinese lake. And then when Biden came into office, he actually didn't change any of that. He not only didn't change any of that, he amplified it. So he kept all the tariffs essentially on Chinese goods. Then he slapped 100% tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. He increased the freedom of navigation exercises in the South China Sea. He created a new alliance called AUKUS between Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States, which allows Australia to have nuclear-powered submarines. And he, I think, kept the Trump policies in place, and I think he amplified them. So I would expect that Trump would continue with his own policies and the policies he inherits from Biden, which, by the way, also include banning American companies sending anything that could benefit the Chinese military, such as anything to do with AI, anything to do with quantum computing. So there's going to be, I think, a fair amount of continuity. The wild card here is Taiwan. So as I mentioned, Xi has said you have to be ready to take Taiwan by 2027. Now, taking Taiwan is not an easy task. The hardest military maneuver is an amphibious invasion. That said, there are other things that China could do. So China could blockade Taiwan, which is an act of war, and effectively cut it off from the rest of the world. The question is, what would Trump do? And the answer is no one knows, because he's inherently a very unpredictable human being. Now, what has he said publicly? Publicly, in July, he said that Taiwan should pay for the United States for its defense, which is a very kind of Trumpian kind of construction. That doesn't seem like the kind of statement somebody embracing Taiwanese independence from China would make. And I think about President Biden. President Biden went on 60 Minutes and was asked directly, what would you do if China took Taiwan or tried to take Taiwan? He said, we would come to their defense. And that was a very interesting answer. He said it 3 or 4 times, and sometimes his staff would try and clear it up. But on 60 Minutes, he said it very declaratively. That ended decades of strategic ambiguity, which is the idea that the Chinese don't really know what we'd do. Well, now they have this very unambiguous answer from Biden that he would come to Taiwan's aid. Now, what would Trump do? We just don't know. But I think it is reasonable to assume that this crisis will happen during this second Trump term. It is worth noting CSIS, which is a big Washington-based think tank, ran a war game 24 times what an amphibious invasion of Taiwan, what that would do. Hundreds of American aircraft would go down, dozens of American ships, and tens of thousands of American and allied soldiers would die. Now, if I'm the president, I'm President Donald Trump, and that's the bill that I'm going to get, and that you know you're going to get, I think that Trump would probably say, I'm not sure I want to pay that bill. Because one thing that Trump, I think, actually genuinely believes is he does not like bloodshed or war. It's kind of a consistent theme of his. So he may well say, I mean, already there's been a de-risking, as it were. If you think about the $6 billion that's going to Arizona for high-end superconductors, chips, et cetera. So I mean, we're not decoupling from China, but we are trying to de-risk our exposure to China, in part by having the CHIPS Act and the $52 billion that came with it. But anyway, so that's, I think, one big question is what would Trump do on China? And also a certain amount of continuity with Biden. Then the other continuity is the Middle East. Now, lots of things changed in the Middle East just in the last 3 or 4 days. One is we have a ceasefire between Hezbollah and Israel, which is going to go on for 60 days. We also have what used to be an al-Qaeda affiliate taking over one of the biggest cities in Syria within the last 48 hours. The affiliate has gone through a variety of different names, but it's al-Qaeda in a different, it's been called Nusra, it's been called HTS is its present sort of acronym. But the point is it's an al-Qaeda group that has taken advantage of Russian and Iranian weakness right now to seize Aleppo and also to threaten other major Syrian cities. How this will turn out, I don't know, because 2 weeks ago, if you asked me who won the Syrian war, I would say President Bashar al-Assad had won it a long time ago. Today, he's losing the war, and wars are psychological, and the Syrian army is sort of collapsing without putting up much of a fight. So things are in flux. But what would be the similarities or the differences between Trump and Biden on the Middle East? I think there will be a lot of similarities. Let's start with the first Trump term. Trump The Abraham Accords, which basically made peace between Israel and a number of Arab states, were conducted without any real gain for the Palestinian people. Trump appointed a pro-settler ambassador by the name of David Friedman, who I think had been a lawyer of his, to be the American ambassador in Israel. There was a record amount of settlement activity during the first Trump term. In fact, Friedman, the ambassador, said that if Israel annexed parts of the West Bank, that it would be okay with the United States. So it was a very permissive environment. As you know, Jared Kushner, famously, Netanyahu slept in Jared Kushner's boyhood bedroom when he was, so they've been friends for a long time. And that's the kind of environment that sort of existed during the first Trump term, which was, I would say, very pro-Netanyahu. And so to what extent did Biden change that? I don't think he changed that at all. Biden may have made occasional sort of gesturings towards, like too many civilian casualties in Gaza, but effectively, American policy throughout the Gaza war and throughout the war against Hezbollah has been let the Israelis do what they're going to do. And I would anticipate that would be very similar in a Trump term. Now, again, because Trump is, one thing you can predict about him is he's unpredictable. He also has some sort of grievance against Netanyahu, which may involve Netanyahu congratulating Biden on his election win or something else to do with the assassination of Soleimani, the Iranian general who was killed in Iraq by an American drone. But the point is he has some kind of beef against Netanyahu. And also he sees himself as the great deal maker. Could he get some kind of agreement to bring things, to some kind of solution in the Middle East? Who knows? I mean, right now the peace party in Israel is basically dead. There's very little constituency in Israel for a two-state solution, no matter how much there might be in other parts of the world. But he does have significant leverage coming in. He's appointed Mike Huckabee, as you know, to be the ambassador to Israel. Mike Huckabee has said in the past that there is no such thing as a Palestinian. So that doesn't suggest any kind of great appetite by the ambassador to come up with some kind of deal. But again, there's going to be continuity, and could Trump do some sort of deal that brings a measure of peace to the region? Maybe. Another big wild card here is Iran. Iran has taken tremendous hits in the last, since October 7th, in the sense that its major proxy, the largest non-state military in the world, Hezbollah, lost most of its leadership, lost most of its missiles, lost most of its missile production sites, which is why Israel was prepared to do a deal with Hezbollah, because they've been largely neutered to a large degree. And then Iran itself faces big problems because if you look at the Israeli strikes on Iranian air defenses or their ability to evade Iranian air defenses, it basically shows that Iran is sort of a sitting duck. If Israel chose to take out Iran's nuclear facilities, it probably couldn't from the point of view that they're buried too deeply. The United States does have the capacity to do it. But the point is Iran must recognize right now its biggest affiliate is more or less completely, very severely damaged, not out of business. Hamas is also severely damaged, another proxy group that Iran has supported. And the only one that's doing somewhat well still are the Houthis, who continue to attack global shipping going through the Red Sea, which is about 12 to 13% of global trade. But so if I was sitting in Iran right now, it's not an accident they elected a relative moderate, of course these are kind of very relative terms, to be the president, somebody who presented himself as somebody who might be able to do some deal with the West. So again, Trump may well try and make a deal there. One other commonality between the two presidents is their desire to pull back from the world. You know, both on the left of the Democratic Party and on the right of the Republican Party, they're basically the same, which is American isolationism. And I think this is actually kind of a delusional view of the way, so a lot of people sort of think the absence of American troops equals peace, and I don't believe that, personally. I think the absence of American troops could be a big problem. Look at when the Obama administration, Tony Blinken and Joe Biden, when Joe Biden was vice president, they negotiated the withdrawal of American troops at the end of 2011 from Iraq. Within 3 years, ISIS was marching on Baghdad and had taken over much of the country. So, you know, we are in the middle of negotiating another agreement with Iraq, the Biden administration is, which might reduce the American presence in Iraq to something close to zero. There are 2,500 American troops there right now. There are 900 in Syria. They're all there on an anti-ISIS mission. But simply pulling all these troops out doesn't guarantee that somehow ISIS might not spring back. And I think there's an important psychological aspect to the United States maintaining even a relatively small footprint in these countries to prevent that happening. So those were some of the similarities. And of course, both Biden and Trump, bipartisan sort of fiasco in terms of the Afghan withdrawal. Trump negotiated the agreement, Biden went through with it, and we see that the Taliban now controls Afghanistan. So those were some of the continuities. The differences, personnel as policy was a mantra of the Reagan administration, and the Trump team have certainly thought very carefully about personnel issues. Obviously, Matt Gaetz didn't go so well. If you've read the New Yorker piece today about Pete Hegseth, I would really recommend it if you haven't, because I think it might basically end his candidacy. I mean, if somebody is consistently drunk almost all the time and consistently harassing women and basically unable to manage a really small NGO, he's probably not the guy to run a department with 3 million people and a budget at almost $1 trillion. So we'll see. And there are other controversial people who were put forward. Kash Patel on Saturday, Thanksgiving weekend, traditionally a good time to bury news that you think may not go down too well. Kash Patel, I'm sure the Hunter Biden pardon, which came also on a Sunday or Thanksgiving, or another time to bury news. But President Biden must be surely looking at some of the people that Trump is putting forward in the DOJ and FBI, and concerned that his son would not fare well. But so there is a group of Trump disses himself from Project 2025, which this 877-page document. Has anybody read it? Quite a few hands. Amazing. I can't say I've read the whole thing. I read things that were of interest to me. But Trump knew that the federal ban on abortion was a complete killer for his election. That's why he distanced himself from Project 2025. CNN found that 140 people involved in writing Project 2025 had worked for Trump. So clearly they made the mistake about being too public about their intentions. The America First Policy Institute didn't make very clear their intentions. But if you take together what Project 2025 said and the America First Policy Institute, you have basically the idea that federal employees should be at-will employees, which means that they can be fired for any reason, pretty much, other than some outright malfeasance. Now, what's interesting about that, I think the Pendleton Act of 1883 started the professional civil service in this country. So there are 4,000. I think the American system is a very good one, where you have political appointees not throughout the government, which is how it was throughout the 19th century, where basically Billy Bob got this job and your uncle got this job, and it wasn't a merit-based civil service. But we have a merit-based civil service, which you can sort of say, well, they don't do a good job, or whatever it is, but it is not simply people that are known on the campaign. 4,000 political appointees making sure that the president, his or her wishes are sort of acceded to. This approach would bring in 50,000 political appointees, which I think take the intelligence community. There's a very good review. There's something called the Plum Book, which I just looked at recently. The Plum Book is all those jobs. And there are only 4 at CIA, which is a really good idea, because CIA, what is their job? The CIA's job is to tell you the news you don't want to hear, the jobs that don't fit with your preconceptions. You don't want a loyalist or a political flunky just to tell you what you want to hear. It's actually not the way the system works. But we could have a system where the intelligence community becomes more and more staffed with loyalists. And by the way, it's very short-sighted, because ultimately there's going to be a Democratic administration, and it would be very bad for us to be in a situation where every alternative administration from a different party could get rid of a large number of people throughout the federal bureaucracy. That would be, and what would be the incentive, let's say, learning Chinese as an American State Department employee, or being an arms negotiation expert if you knew that every time a new president came in, you're in danger of losing your job. So I think it's a bad idea. We'll see how it goes. On Ukraine, you know, there is a peace deal that has been put forward by Keith Kellogg, who's an old friend of Trump's. He's a general aged 80 who he was actually Pence's national security advisor, and basically is to freeze the battle lines in place and then start a peace agreement. I saw that for the first time, Zelensky sort of made a statement today, I think on Sky News or somewhere like that, saying that he was prepared to give up the territory that's been taken so far. The Ukrainians are now much less interested in getting back territory the Russians have taken and getting some kind of security guarantee out of the United States government. Now, there is no universe in which Putin would ever accept NATO today, tomorrow, decades from now. But you could imagine perhaps security guarantees similar to what the United States has with Japan, minus American troops on the ground. Or you could find some kind of face-saving way so that there are security guarantees. They wouldn't be perfect, but at this point, Ukraine's losing the war. A very useful statistic is that the average age of the Ukrainian soldier is 40. And there aren't that many wars that have been won by people my age, or you know, well, I'm 61. So, but the point is 40 is an astonishing number for your average age of your combatants. I do think that Trump, you know, in Ukraine may be able to get a deal. The Ukrainians know that both houses are controlled by the Republicans. There's going to be no more aid packages, but I think they may be surprised by Trump, because Trump is not the Putin kind of stooge that sometimes he's portrayed as. It was Trump who gave Javelin missiles to the Ukrainians, which are anti-tank weapons, very effective ones, not Obama. And if Trump had gotten in the way of that $61 billion aid agreement that went through the House for Ukraine, the Republicans would not have voted for it. And by saying nothing, he gave permissions for Republicans to vote for that agreement. And then, of course, we'll have deportations. I mean, we'll see. Trump has promised up to 20 million deportations. I mean, think about, there are 1.2 million Americans in prison right now as of 2022. So if you're going to deport, let's say you're going to deport 15 million people, well, think about the number of immigration agents you need to hire. Think about the number of detention facilities you need to build. Think about the number of judges you need to hire. I mean, there are only 650 immigration judges right now. It's one of the reasons that the asylum process is so screwed up, as there are so few people in the system. So I think there are going to be some practical issues in enforcing a lot of this. On tariffs, you know, as you know, Trump has said that, the campaign trail, he said 60% tariffs on Chinese, 10% across the board. I looked into this question. In fact, the president can't just unilaterally impose tariffs. It is the Congress that has the power to tax, and tariffs are a tax. The president can only impose tariffs in a situation where another country is not playing by the rules. So I think you know, for those of us who might be concerned about a 10% kind of increase of tariffs across the board, this may be harder to implement than perhaps has been presented. But of course, Trudeau is down at Mar-a-Lago, was there yesterday. Obviously, he's very concerned about this. On climate change, you know, the Trump administration pulled out of the Paris Climate Agreement within a few months of taking office. I anticipate them doing the same, despite the fact that 2024 is the warmest year on record, and despite the fact the United States is the principal producer of energy and gas, something the Biden administration doesn't advertise about itself. Biden administration has produced more energy and gas than any administration in history, and we're the second biggest emitter. So, but I do anticipate we will pull out of the Paris Climate Agreement. So, and then finally, you know, Trump himself is predictably unpredictable. So, in summation, fasten your seatbelts. And if there are any questions, I'm happy to pretend to answer them. So, yeah.
Sanctions sometimes have trouble working. Iran has had the benefit of Western sanctions for a while, and B is the nuclear agreement that Trump fathered able to come in this new politic.
You know, we have sanctioned the Iranian regime since 1979, when they took our embassy officials. Sanctions, really, generally speaking, don't work. I mean, you walk into the Oval Office and you say, sir or madam, I have 3 options for you. 1 is we go to war. 2, we do nothing. 3, we do sanctions. Oh, sanctions, that sounds like a really good idea. Every president since Jimmy Carter has sanctioned the Iranian regime. Has their behavior improved? No. Did they start, I mean, they're actually, their influence is spread throughout the Middle East. They control Hezbollah, that largely controls Lebanon. They control the Houthis, that largely control Yemen. They control good chunks of Iraq through the Shia militias. They rescued Assad from being overthrown. So the sanctions have had absolutely no effect on Iranian behavior, with the one big exception. It did bring them to the negotiating table on the Iranian nuclear agreement. And they wanted sanctions relief, and we gave it to them. And they stopped enriching their nuclear weapons from, a nuclear weapon needs 90% enriched uranium. They stopped at 3.5% as a result of the agreement. 2018, Trump pulled out of the agreement, put more sanctions on. The Iranians now have enough fissile material for many nuclear weapons, according to the Defense Intelligence Agency. So sanctions in general don't work. On the Iranian case, they did work in one very specific area. But, we started sanctioning Vladimir Putin in 2014 for taking Crimea. Didn't stop him from invading eastern Ukraine in 2022. So sanctions, generally speaking, don't work, but they work because it gives the appearance of doing something even if you don't really get what you actually want from them. And they may impoverish the Iranian population, but they don't really get the outcome. And they also had the paradoxical effect of making the government stronger, because who benefits from the Iranian sanctions? It's the Iranian National Revolutionary Guard that control a lot of the industry. So anyway, a long way of saying I'm not a great believer in sanctions. I think there's only one case, other than the Iranian nuclear case, I can think of. Sanctions may have had a role in ending the apartheid regime in South Africa, but otherwise they are a tool that doesn't really work.
Thanks.
You can talk loudly and I'll repeat the question. Yeah,
thanks for that comprehensive overview. Certainly kind of stretches the mind. 2 points I didn't hear you comment on. If you just curious about your thoughts. One is on the risk for nuclear war or even accidental. There's been a lot of, you kind of alluded to proliferation, and of course Putin has been doing lots of saber rattling lately and launched a mid-range missile. And then the other is just maybe a quick comment on what you think the coming orientation will be around alliances like NATO.
Pardon me. On NATO, the U.S. Congress has tried to Trump-proof the United States getting taken out of NATO. You now need a supermajority in the Senate to take out, to get out of the alliance. You also need both houses voting for it. I think there are plenty of Republicans who don't want to get out of NATO. And I think Trump can do something different, which is undercut NATO in a public manner. Let's say he can't. John Bolton thinks that he wants to get out. Who knows? But he can say things like, I don't plan to come to the defense of country X in the Baltics. If the commander-in-chief of the most important part of the alliance says that the alliance is not going to do its Article 5 kind of collective self-protection, the alliance is de facto doesn't really work. So we'll see what he says on NATO. Certainly in the past he's said it. I wrote a book about Trump's first term, and I have a great anecdote about. So Angela Merkel came to the White House, and they didn't have a warm relationship. And Trump they did up this invoice about the amount of money she owed for NATO, and it was like $600 billion. And she was like, "That's not really how NATO works. It's not like." But the fact, it's 2% of GDP that they put into their own defense, not that they owe the United States. Anyway, so he'll do some of this, and he can undercut NATO by his statements. And on the nuclear weapons, START, which is this is the last nuclear weapons treaty that is left standing, expires in 2026. We are about to see a three-way nuclear arms race. The Chinese have no interest in kind of negotiations about nuclear weapons kind of reductions. I mean, they have 500 nuclear weapons already. They clearly plan to have a lot more. We, the United States, and the Russians have roughly 1,500 nuclear weapons each, down from a time. I mean, one of the most successful things we did was bringing, I think we had 11,000 at one point. So we've done well on that. But once this START treaty expires, we'll see what happens. There was only, this is typically a lot of bad news, but there was one piece of good news, and when you talk about the world at large and what might happen. When Biden and Xi recently met, they both agreed that artificial intelligence would not be used in decisions on nuclear weapons. Now, what does that agreement mean? Who the hell knows? But at least both sides are sort of cognizant of the fact that introducing artificial intelligence into the decision-making around nuclear weapons would be, probably wouldn't be smart. Okay.
And unfortunately, we don't have time.
Yeah.
But, Peter is available afterwards during the cocktail hour, so I would encourage you, and he's very kindly agreed to stay around for that. So if you have further questions, Zafar, please come up. The gentleman in the back, one last question.
Yeah, I want to maybe push back a little bit on your closing comments about sanctions, specifically as it applies to Iran. And if we compare the last 4 years to the previous 4 years, Hamas, the Houthis, Hezbollah, and Israel themselves, or not Israel, but Iran themselves, have all attacked Israel directly multiple times, hundreds of times. And they did that with the money. I know the figure has been thrown out there, and it's a bit arguable, $100 billion of funds that were released. Partly I'm asking this because I just finished H.R. McMaster's book, where he makes a pretty compelling case that the sanctions were effective, and that we made a pretty significant mistake, and we're paying for that mistake now by lifting those sanctions.
Yeah, I mean, I don't disagree with some of
that. Thank you. Please join me in thanking Peter again. Peter, thanks. Thank you very much.